Brought to you by Connect.js, Atlanta's premier JavaScript conference. Sponsored in part by FeatherDirect. Need a mobile app? Contact us for your custom mobile solution.
All right, good afternoon. Let's try that again. Good afternoon. All right, so before I start, just to make sure, everyone in this room, did you attend the first session? Anyone who didn't attend the first session? Okay, I don't mean to call you out, but if you didn't attend the first session, you might be a little lost in the second one. Just a disclaimer. Let us continue our discussion on Angular. Where were we? We have, let me inspect this with Firebug. So I have a console open, and let us get started. So console is clear, we have done. If I uncheck it, the done disappears. Now, let us talk about adding new to-dos. If I'm going to add new to-dos, what do I need from a UI perspective? What do I need? An input box will be nice, sure. Type text, and because this is HTML5, let's get a little fancy. Right, this isn't necessary, obviously, this is HTML5 spec. How do I know what the user typed in? How do I capture it? Very good. ng model. We'll just randomly create some property called new to do text. How's that? Let's add a button called add. Sure, why not? And we are going, now of course this is a single page application. Oops, sorry about that. This is a single page application, doesn't mean that we violate HTML semantics. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to surround it with a form. Everyone okay with that? You're still submitting a form, right? When you click the add button, you're still submitting a form. The fact that it goes to a single page app versus back to the server doesn't change those semantics. All right. Now, let's see how we're doing so far. Okay, so we have a checkbox. We have an input box. We have the placeholder. I want to retire, right? That was the plan. I click the add button, obviously nothing happens because we haven't wired anything up yet. With that said, when you want to capture the click on a button, you use yet another directive called ng-click. And in this case, we are going to simply invoke a function called add new to do. Now right off the bat, what do you think this add new to do will need? What's that? The text. Oh, this is a bad name. What did I call this? Oh, new to do text. All right, fine, whatever. We'll pass it in. Now, based on your current understanding, where will Angular go looking for this function? Current scope. Very good. 3 times, remember. Scope. Okay, I forget what I called it. Add new to do. And that's a function that gets some text property in it. Now here we have a choice, and it depends on the use case you're playing with. Remember that when we add this new to do, we have to tack it on this array, right? We could do one of two things. We could simply say to-dos dot push a new object whose text happens to be the passed in t. But what's the problem here? The problem is that you are assuming something called to-dos exists in scope, right? If we ever decide to extract this function out as a reusable function, you're kind of screwed, right? So you have an option here. You could simply pass in to-dos, which means here I can just pass in the whole array. And why can I do that? because I'm still inside this controller that has to-dos on scope, and I can pass it in. So everyone okay with this? All right. Now, the point being is, think about how you design your functions. Just because things are in scope doesn't mean you use them willy-nilly. Go one way or the other. Make a deliberate choice when you design your functions. With that said, I'm going to leave it here for now because I think you've got the gist. Okay, so I want to retire. Oh, look at that. And if I check it, timestamp, timestamp, timestamp. Everything works. Everything is wired up correctly. Does that make sense? Easy peasy, right? Is the problem. Now I'm retired. I'm allowed to have blank to-dos. This might be a bug, potentially, right? What do I do? Validations. Now, your off the bat reaction to this might be check if this to-do text length is empty or what have you, right? That might be a good way to see if I should push onto this array a to-do. But we are living in HTML5 land, which means we have HTML5 validations available to us. Which means that here I can simply say required. I'm inside a form, I can say input box is required, which is an HTML5 attribute, not an Angular attribute. And what that does is a couple of things. You see a little red border. Firefox does tell me this field is required. Unfortunately, sorry about that. It does nothing to stop the submission, but it does bring up this very informative field which says, please fill out this field. Thank you very much. Now, again, this is a use casey thing. This can depend on what your application expects, what are you expected to do in this case. Let's say we took something very simple. Let's say we did, we said, let's disable the button. Disable the button if the field is empty, right? Let's do that. Well, for one, if the button's disabled, this is kind of pointless. I mean, how are you going to submit the form if the button is disabled? So one thing that HTML5 lets you do is it lets you do this no validate business, which is basically telling the browser. It does not mean don't validate. There's a little confusion about this part of the spec. It does not mean don't validate. It means don't do all the visual glitzy thing, right? The form still validates by the browser. The only question is, what does it do after that? So I'm going to tell the browser, shut up, right? I got this. Then I need to disable this button. I need to disable this button if this form is invalid. That's essentially the use case here, right? What do? I use something called ng, my dyslexia always kicks in here, ng disabled. Disable this button if the current form is invalid. Now, a little bit of the magic here. So first what I'm going to do is put a name to this guy. I'm just going to call him new to-do form, and I'll explain why I'm doing this in a second. When you have a form inside an Angular application, what you get under the covers is a form controller. Angular will create a form controller under the covers. You can get to that controller by its name. The form controller has properties on it that you can interrogate. You can ask the form controller, are you valid? Are you invalid? And what the form controller does is it goes to each of its models, right? Each of its models and says, are you valid? And that model says, nope, I'm not valid. I'm a required field and I'm not filled in. The form is invalid. I can find that out. So what I can do here is this button is disabled if the new to-do form is $invalid. $invalid is a property on the form controller whose name happens to be new to-do form because that's what I told Angular to give it. Does that make sense? How's everyone doing? Now you might have noticed this little pattern here, this dollar business, right? In Angular, the convention is if it is a property that Angular manages or creates, it will be prefixed by the $sign. If your organization has a convention where you mark private variables with something or whatever, please don't use $sign. It just causes confusion, right? Because when I'm looking at your code and I see $private var, I don't know, is that an Angular var or is it your var? So pick something else. Pick underscore, pick hashbang. I don't care. Don't pick hashbang. Pick underscore, right? Or whatever. Don't pick $sign. The convention in Angular apps is the $sign is reserved for the Angular team. Does that make sense? All right. So let's see how we're doing. This is ng disabled. We'll refresh the page. And I don't know how many of you can tell, but this button is actually disabled. And if I start typing, you can see it gets enabled and everything works. The other thing that most people have a question about is what does happen if I put in white space? And the HTML5 spec says that if a field is required, white space is not a valid value for an input box. So take away from this section, HTML5 validations are available to you via the form controller in Angular. You can interrogate the form to ask it, are you valid, are you invalid? HTML5 introduces a whole bunch of new validations, right? You can say input type text, input type email, input type phone number, input type currency with a formatter. You can say all kinds of things, and guess what? No more regex. If you say input type email, how many people have written a regular expression parser for email to check if the email is valid or not? No one? Really? Oh, they're much better. Thank God. I thought I was the only one. You don't have to do that anymore because the browser will do it for you, right? If I said over here, input type email, I don't know if Firefox supports it yet or not. It should. Yeah, so still invalid at blah.com. And now it's valid. I don't have to do any checking. The browser does all the heavy lifting for me. Leverage HTML5 validations. Your knee-jerk reaction will be to do the legwork because we've done it for so long. Right? How many of you have woken up in sweats in the middle of the night when you remember the regular expression you wrote? No one? Am I the only one? Numbers, email, even digits like currency, like dot, two numbers or whatever. It's all validated for you. You have to do nothing. Yes, sir?
What if you didn't want to work off of the form controller at all? And would you just like bind the ng disabled to a property on the model and then just control that property elsewhere?
So that's a good question. Now, I don't know why you would ever want to do that, but to answer your question, this, where did it go? This model, on it has properties like valid, invalid. So the form controller is just going to every model and saying, are you valid or invalid? That's what it's doing under the covers. So you can get to those models, and I forget the exact syntax, but you can say, look at that model and ask it if it's valid or not, and then use that directly over here instead of going through the controller. Is that your question? Yes. The property actually resides on the model, not in the form control. The form control is merely interrogating all of its models to find out yay or nay. That's all it's doing. Anyone else?
Yes.
Oh yes, sorry, forgive me.
Since Angular explicitly gives you the form controller in the past, is it any way to get at it and try to add properties to it or manipulate it if you have a separate file with modules for controllers in it? Is it any way to maybe add to that form controller or do something with it?
So the question is there any way to get to the form controller to add more properties on it?
Yes, so do something if you have a separate file, like maybe controllers.js.
Mm-hmm.
You want to do some manipulation to it.
Yes, so you can get to, so if you have a form controller, well, if you get a form controller created for you inside another controller. Did this die on me just now?
Yeah.
This could be a problem. Hello? I think the battery's dead. Hello? All right, time to yell. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Excellent. The question is, if I have a form controller inside a controller, can I get to it to do something with it? Right? And the answer is yes, absolutely. You can get to a form controller inside a controller in your JavaScript code. Absolutely, at any point. I don't know why you won't do that, but sure.
No, I'm trying to do it in the past, that's why I was asking.
Okay. Yeah, yes, you can. This is the same thing. This is basically looking it up. When I say new to do form dot dollar invalid, it is looking it up on the current controller, which is first controller, whatever we called it in our case. It's doing the same thing under the covers. You can get to it. Yes. All right. Now the people in the back. If I start to drop, please let me know. All right. Going forward. Make sure I didn't break anything. Retire. Oh, what did I break? Thank you, sir. Okay, excellent. So, we can list to-dos, we can check them off, we can add new to-dos. Let's talk about filters. I am retired. I am allowed to not have any to-dos. You might have 50 to-dos. How do you find a particular to-do? Your customer requires you to have a search box. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a search box over here. So input type text, and like always we will give it a model called search text. How's that? So when the user types text in there, they should filter the list based on what you're searching for. Make sure I didn't break anything. Of course, if I search, nothing happens. Now, this repeater is repeating over every item in the to-dos array. If I could restrict the to-dos array, I'll automatically get the functionality I desire, right? Let's say, for example, that to-dos array looked at the search field and only passed to the repeater all the to-dos that matched the criteria. Guess what? I can get what I want. The way Angular does this is it does something called filters. Does everyone know what the pipe does in Unix? Okay, you have pipes and filters on the terminal. You have this also in DOS, I believe, right? You say list all the files, pipe it through some grep, pipe it through less. The thing to bear in mind about filters is that it's not always about reduction. It's also about transformation. What is less? It's transformation, right? Take this text and display it out here. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, as every to-do comes through, oh, thank you.
Keep talking.
Yep. As every to-do comes through, filter it by search text. Let's see what I broke. Learn, speak, profit. Oh, come on, tell me you're not impressed. Hello? All right. Now I'll yell at this, right? Because I'm so used to yelling.
That would also work for anything that's in the model.
I'm sorry,
That would
what?
work for anything in the model. Also, you can type numbers that check for it. Yeah.
So the question up front is, or rather a comment was, this will work for anything in the model, which is actually very astute. If you notice down here, well, okay, let me take a step back. What's happening here? What's happening is we have a filter that is offered to us by Angular, and what that filter does is it takes this array of to-dos, and somehow, and we'll see how this happens in a second, magically greps against this text. So it's taking this array of to-dos and somehow seeing if any one of those to-dos matches. So basically what you are repeating over is a restricted list based on this value. Initially, this is empty, which means everything passes. As I start typing, Angular then restricts the list. Now, did you catch what's happening here? That is not a static list item. It is a dynamic. It is something that gets updated anytime that input box changes. I think someone in the back earlier had a question, is when do these values get propagated? This is a live DOM. Any change propagates events, and people who are interested in those events will appropriately update the view on the way out. Does that make sense? This is huge, right? Now, going back to the comment, this text learn Angular works well. Actually, Angular works well, and so does 141. The timestamp. Now perhaps you can tell what's happening under the covers over here. Essentially what Angular does is, because I gave it some text string to grep against, it looks at every value in that object and sees if there's a match. And if there's a match, it says, good, you are good to go, you can pass through the filter. Everybody else gets dropped. So then the question might be, in my opinion, this is good enough, I say ship it. No user is ever going to type a timestamp in, come on, right? But what if we do want to restrict only by the text? Well, what you can do here is you can say dot text. Now, what's happening here is actually a little bit more convoluted than meets the eye. What we are doing is we are creating an object called search text. And we are setting on that object a property called text. When I start typing in that field, Angular updates the value of the text property on this object. It then updates the repeater, who looks at the to-do and says, do you have a text property on you? If you have a text property on you, I am going to take the text property value in the current to-do, match it against what's in that text box. So it is matching key for key. Does that make sense? How's everyone doing? Am I yelling, by the way? Okay, you guys are too polite. Yes, sir.
Two questions. Number one, is it case sensitive? And number two, can you replace after the filter semicolon? Does it have to be a property, or can it be a function that you can override their filtering?
Okay, so two questions. The first question is it case sensitive? Let's try it. We can answer the first question pretty easily, right? So that might sound actually very good. Let's type uppercase G, and yes, it is not case sensitive. Or no, it is case sensitive. No, it's not. Whatever, you get it. Right, so that kind of answered your first question, hopefully, right? The second question is, can I make this some sort of a function call? Right? The answer is no. Though this looks like filter, it's not actually a keyword in Angular. It is a filter whose name happens to be filter. It's just a function that takes two arguments. It takes some value and an array of something else. And you do inside it what you expect to do. It takes every value, takes the property of each object and matches and returns the newly restricted array. That's what it's doing. So this cannot be a function. No. This has to be a property, because it is the way a filter is defined. Now, you could write your own, and we will see how to do that. I think I have a demo in my use case to show you how to write your own filter. And there, you could give it anything you want. This filter given by Angular to you cannot take a function. It has to be a expression, which is something gets evaluated. Does that make sense? Question, someone had a question. Yes, sir.
So each time you type a value in the input box, each character performs another round of dirty checking.
Correct. Now, 1.3 allows you to say, hold on till something happens, like an on blur or a lose focus. But up until 1.3, which was true till last Tuesday. So 1.3 came out on Tuesday. It was every character. Question.
Can the repeater take a function? Instead of lose.
Oh, so can this be a function? I believe the answer is yes. As long as it evaluates to a collection.As. Anybody else? Yes. Oh, sorry. 1 second. Yes, sir.
Two questions. So if I want to filter on like a begins with or greater than, something like that, I'm going to have to write my own, or are there built-in filters?
So the first question is, if I have to write a filter that does begins with or ends with or something like that, do I have to write my own filter? The answer is, out of the box, that is not provided to you. You have to write your own. Yes.
The second one, if I had a button on there that said like bulk do it and it passed into to-dos, is it going to pass in the full to-dos or the filter list of to-dos?
So I'm sorry, you had a button there which said pass in what? Or a checkbox, you said, right?
No, a button that just says bulk process or something like that.
Uh-huh.
Pass in the entire to-dos.
Mhm.
Is it going to pass the filtered list or is it going to pass the entire list?
Pass the repeater, it will be the restricted list.
Hold on, what was that again?
Pass the restrictor. So pass the repeater, it will be the restricted list.
So if I had a button that right after the add button or something that said bulk process, that passes in to-dos, it's going to pass the
Oh, that would be the full list. Yes. Yes. So the question is, if I had another button down below which said, bulk process all the to-dos, will that be a restricted to-dos list? Like if I say to-dos, is that restricted or is it the full? It is the full. Only within the repeater is the restriction happening, not outside. Outside you still have the full to-dos available to you. Because, and to prove that beyond reasonable doubt, notice that I've restricted the list, but my to-dos down below that I'm displaying is all the to-dos. Someone had a question here. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so if you type 1.1 now, it would still show so how did you go, if you go back to the code, you filtered on search text, but not search text.text.
Correct, because what I'm saying is now I'm not actually comparing a string value against an object. I'm comparing two objects that happen to have text properties. And Angular lines up those properties and says match the values.
So does that property have to be the word text?
It has to be the same property as that property. Does that make sense? So now you take two objects and you kind of do an equality match, or kind of like an equality match. Right? Take this value from this, take this value from this, grab the two. Yes, sir.
Maybe this is coming later, but how easy is it to get in the middle of that to do some sort of animation? I don't want everything to just disappear immediately. I want it to fade out. Like as you're typing, things should fade out.
Okay, so the question is, how easy is it to like control how that restriction happens? Like if I don't want it to like just disappear, it should fade out, or do a little jig in a dance before it goes anywhere. I don't cover that today, but Angular has a directive called ng-animate, which only sole purpose is to do stuff like that. In fact, let me show you something real quick here. So I'm going to inspect this. So remember that this is a required field, right? Notice that by default you get these whole bunch of classes attached automatically on that input box. ng pristine, ng invalid, ng invalid required. All of that hooks into the ng-animate, and you can do magical stuff. You can say when this class changes, apply this CSS3 transformation or whatever. I don't cover that today, but it is there, it is possible. And in fact, 1.2 release primarily was focused on making the web dance. Yes. Is everyone doing okay with this? When does the session end? I know it's a stupid question, but I need to know. Okay. All right. Quick note, this kind of transformation that you see, this filter, is array restrictions, right? It gets an array of objects, grabs against those array and returns something. If you see down here, I showed you this earlier, this is a text transformation filter. Basically what I'm saying is take this collection of objects and transform it into its JSON. So it's a different kind of filter, but it goes back to the Unix filter pipe strategy, right? Filtering is not only about restriction, it's also about transformation. You can get other filters out of the box. For example, I can say pipe this through uppercase, and now everything becomes uppercase. You can do lowercase, you can do format currency, you can do format date, and you can write your own filters. And I'll show you an example in a few seconds. Is that okay? Everyone doing all right? Okay, now, today is like update day for some reason. Remind me later. How's that? What I'm going to do, since we have 15 minutes, and I want to show you how you do AJAX requests in Angular, because everyone loves the server for some reason. I don't know, every time I give this talk, people are like, how do you do AJAX? Anyhow, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a git reset hard head here. I did not, this is not intentional, I promise you. Okay, before I get into the Ajax thing, does everyone know or has written a RESTful endpoint? Right? So typically your endpoint gives you a contract, some sort of API, right? Whether that's first level, second level, third level REST, whatever it is, this is essentially CRUD over HTTP. My backend server makes me these promises, and I apologize, I don't have two lasers. If I do an HTTP get on /todos, the server will get me back all the to-dos on the backend. If I do a get to-dos /some ID, 1, 2, 3, it will return me the to-do with that ID. If I post on /todos, it creates a new to-do. If I put, and again, please understand, this is not convention, it's whatever you make it to be, right? Put /todos /IDs updates the to-do with this ID, and a delete on this deletes the to-do with ID. Is everyone okay with this? Makes sense? This is my backend. How it's implemented is not your concern. As an Angular developer, shouldn't be anyone's concern. All you care about is I make this Ajax request, I want this supplied to me. With that said, what I just did is I git reset hard, so I basically set all my files to a working version. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to wake up the server. This, and I'm pretty sure the people in the back can't see that. This is Lineagen. This is Clojure's build tool. Think of it as waking up a Jetty server locally. That's all I'm doing. So I'm going to wake that up. And while that happens, let us talk about the changes that happen under the covers. JavaScript. That's not good. Okay. All right, so going back here, this is the main.js we were playing along all along. First thing, notice that here, remember that square brackets I told you earlier, and I said those square brackets are kind of important. If you forget them, bad things happen. The point of that is to introduce modules that you can plug into your application. Every single page application that you may have used or written or seen has some sort of routing, right? Based on this URL, display this view. Based on this URL, display this view. Angular comes with its own routing engine called ng-route. The nice thing about this is you don't have to use their routing engine. You can write your own routing engine and make it a dependency on your application via this square bracket. So what I'm saying here is my to-dos app has a dependency on ng-route. That's all I'm saying. What I'm saying down here is, again, there's some machinery here, but I have a routing engine. When the URL is /todos, display this view. When the URL is this, display this view. Otherwise, if it's neither one of this, redirect to /todos, which means I use this view again. That's all I'm doing. It's a single page app with two URLs that it understands. Does that make sense? Now, here's the controller we had so far. Now I have a new dependency called $HTTP, which is essentially $Ajax. If you've done jQuery work, it's the guy who knows how to talk to the server. What I have down here, first of all, is this weird function called refresh todos. And what he does an http.get/todos. If you remember our contract, /todos gets all the to-dos. What I do is I say, this is a promise. How many people have used promises in JavaScript? Okay. This is a promise. In this case, I'm not actually leveraging the promise in and of itself. What I'm saying is if you're successful, call this callback. Essentially, I just tack on the returned array of to-dos onto the scope, which is what we had earlier, except I had hard-coded the array of to-dos. Or I have an error function where I put a message on the scope object. The first thing I do the minute I enter the controller is I refresh to-dos. So what happens? Page wakes up, controller wakes up, and the first thing the controller does is turn around and make an HTTP request. Does that make sense? Please don't do this in production. And if you do, we've never met. We had this mark done function where we were putting a timestamp. I'm saying true or false, but we had a timestamp. Well, after you check the box, what do you want to do? You have to send that to do over the wire to the back end and say, update this to do, right? If I go back to this guy and I do a put on to-do/ID, I update that to-do. That's what the server is giving me as a contract. You put this to-do on me, I will update it on the back end, right? What do? I say http.put/to-dos. Every to-do has an ID on it. You don't need to stringify anymore. The newer version of Angular, you can just pass in the to-do. It will stringify it under the covers for you as JSON and send it over the wire. If everything is successful, I refresh all the to-dos, which goes back to my point of if you do this in production, we've never met, right? If you update one to-do, you should refresh all of them. That's kind of silly, but the point still stands. If I create a new to-do, what did we do earlier? We added that to-do onto the array of to-dos. What do I need to do now? I post on /to-dos the newly created to-do. I turn around and I refresh, and if everything worked on the back end, guess what? I have one more to do. Delete is an HTTP delete, and we'll talk about this in a second. By the way, for those who are curious about how to write your own controller, your own filter, this is how simple it is. App.filter, some name, and a function that returns a function that does some work. But this is essentially a filter. Okay, let us see this. Now, where's my console? So I realize this is a little small for the people in the back. I'm going to refresh the page. And notice first, my server just sent back todos.html, which initially is a blank template. Then Angular bootstraps the controller. The controller does what? Right off the bat? Refresh to-dos. Refresh to-dos does a get on /to-dos, which happens to be a JSON object, a JSON array of some 4 objects. So that's what we have here, is what you're seeing is fly to Connect.js, meet awesome developers, fly back home, and be sad, right? That's the initial collection of to-dos that I got from the server. Now, what do we want to do? What happens if I check this box? Well, when I check this box, what we said would happen is mark done. http.put on some URL, the to-do that I just updated, then refresh, which means I should see http put and then http get. If I check the box, notice I put to-do /56. Happens, the ID of that to-do happens to be 56 or whatever. And then that is some object that gets sent over the wire. And then I turn around and refresh all the to-dos. The nice thing now is this is actually persisted. It saved the fact that I checked off that to-do. What happens if I delete a to-do? I should do, well, let's create a new to-do. So be sad and go to therapist, right? I post on to-dos that new to-do, and I refresh to-dos. So if I now add, let me clear this. If I add, notice it does a post and then a get, and go to therapist is now on my to-do list. Does that make sense? How's everyone doing? It is this easy. And finally, I can do a delete. I apologize, but anyway, there's a delete to-dos 56. I refresh, and now if I refresh the page, if everything is working, notice that it is actually gone. With this said, a couple of disclaimers. I know you can get this code, download it, play with it. Please don't do this. If you're not familiar with promises, please get familiar with them. That's the only way you want to do this kind of work. You do not want to do callback hell, right? Trivial examples like this is a good way to demonstrate, but you don't want to do this in production, right? Use all the HTTP functions return promises. Angular also ships with a library which is heavily inspired by Q. Has anyone used Q in JavaScript? Okay. Their service is actually, like here we said HTTP, right? If you wanted their Q service, it is $Q. That's what they call it. And this is a promises library that Angular ships with. Please use this, right? Number one. With that said, does anyone have any questions about AJAX or HTTP calls over the wire?
I just have one question. When you're taking advantage of deep linking, when is it a good idea to marry the controller to the function?
When you're taking advantage of what?
Deep linking.
Uh-huh.
When is it a good use case to marry the controller to the function in ng route?
When is it a good idea to marry the controller to the what?
To the function.
When you are using deep linking, when is it a good idea to? Oh, I see the question. That's a slightly lengthier question. Let's tackle that after the session. Is that okay? Okay. Anybody else? Is everyone okay with the HTTP, AJAX, what have you, thingamagic? Okay. One question I had early on is how do we structure our applications? Notice that this is an Angular module. Let's say I don't want my controllers in this file, right? I want a separate JS file for my controllers. I want a separate JS file for my directives. I want a separate JS file for my services factories, what have you. What I can do is I can create a file. I can create a module in some other file. Let's say controllers.js. I can say angular.module my controllers. Oh, I made the big mistake of not putting that, right? And I can now, this is var controllers, and then controllers.controller, and then copy paste all of this code down there, right? And then here I can say this main application is dependent on ng route and my controllers. So Angular will first load this module, load all the controllers in that, and then make a dependency on this guy. And this is actually how lately everyone has been designing their applications. Is they have separate modules for everything. There's a separate module for controller, there's a separate module for services, directives, functions, filters, what have you. And then they all become dependencies on the main app. This kind of breaks apart the application a little bit more. It's easier to reuse. That's one way to do it. For small applications, don't go nuts. For small applications, we've actually done just one file or two files. But for bigger applications, by all means, split it open. The nice thing about Angular is it's not opinionated on structure. You can design your structure, and it will do the right thing. So that's modularization. Don't do HTTP without callbacks. Okay, we have 2 minutes. Yes, sir.
Just real quick, I've seen NGM being declared in the HTML, and I've seen it declared in the body. Preference?
Preference is HTML.
Not the HTML.
Yep.
Same like when we are applying NGF to one particular area of the page. So still page is getting loaded all on JavaScript.
So the question is, if I put ng app, where's my ng app over here? It's up here. So let's say I moved it down here. Okay, what's your question?
The JavaScript is getting loaded all the AngularJS file into the page.
The AngularJS files, so when do the AngularJS files get loaded? Is that your question? They'll get loaded whether or not I have ng app over here or not. Because that's just the way browsers work, right? Because here, I'm saying you have an input source on this file. So that code is going to execute. The only question, go on.
How it is benefited like when you are applying to any particular section?
So the question is, how is that limiting it to only a part of the page? If it's getting loaded by the browser off the bat. That's like saying, so if I have jQuery in that page, let's say for example, jQuery loading is different from doing anything, right? If I say jQuery make this element disappear, it's only working on one element, right? The fact that you have jQuery in scope of the page has got nothing to do with what it's actually going to do. Those are 2 different things. One is loading a library, one is using it. This will load Angular. Angular will only do something inside, too much, this scope. But that's not the same thing as saying don't load it. Angular still gets loaded. Unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your perspective.
Could you just quickly touch on best practices when to create new directives?
When to use your own directives. Okay, so that might be slightly a head question of this session. I'll answer it real quickly. Remember earlier I mentioned the fact that the view should be declarative, which means if I look at this page, I should be able to tell what's going on. The minute you start writing imperative code, do this, do that, do this, do that, you need a directive. Rule number 1. If you go from declarative to imperative, and it is a matter of taste to some extent, but for the most part, your gut will tell you, too much imperative code in the view, make it a directive. Rule number 1. Rule number 2, if you are doing DOM manipulations outside of Angular's knowledge, for example, you're doing jQuery-ish work outside of Angular's knowledge, inside an area of the application that Angular is watching, it needs to happen inside a directive. You cannot change the DOM underneath Angular and hope Angular will do the right thing. Does that make sense? So if you make a list of elements and then you tell jQuery kill this one element, and Angular is repeating over that, Angular doesn't know you've killed that element. So it's going to either recreate the element or choke. So that has to be inside a directive. Any DOM manipulation outside of Angular's control, inside a directive. Anybody else? Someone had a question up front. Anyone good? All right, well, I'll let you go. I know I have a few more questions to answer, but I'll let you go. Thank you for being so patient. Thank you for coming in. Enjoy the rest of the conference.